You were hoping for Crystal and Sagar, but it's me instead, and you're disappointed. I get it. But remember, you clicked on this video because you thought it was interesting, and maybe you wanted to confirm that Zohran Mamdani's idea for city-owned grocery stores was obviously a great solution to food deserts and affordability. Or you wanted to confirm that it's a ridiculous plan that will fail, just like in the Soviet Union. And if you're in the latter camp, you already know you're not alone. I'm in front of Gristides, and the real estate guy who owns this place, John Catsimatidis, wrote in the Wall Street Journal that the idea of city-owned grocery stores would drag us down a path toward the breadlines of the old Soviet Union.
I think that is like a completely overblown reaction.
I would say that is mildly a hysterical reaction.
That was Julie Hessler and Wendy Goldman. They're experts in the Soviet Union. I sat down with them to actually ask if any of these comparisons to the Soviet Union made any sense. Because Zohran's talking about 5 stores in a city with literally 1,000 supermarkets, 1,002 as of 2023. So why does this freak people out so much? But at the same time, when they say, we've tried it before and it's failed, they're right. City-owned grocery stores have failed a whole bunch of times. Baldwin, Florida, Erie Market, Kansas. You might have just seen reports about empty shelves in a Sunfresh supermarket in Missouri. Cities poured cash into these places and they didn't make it, which really sucks for the residents of these towns because the whole point of these stores is to address food deserts. And as people who live in food deserts will tell you, routine grocery shopping can end up being a huge headache.
Without transportation, I have to call and ask someone to come and take me to the grocery store, or maybe catch a bus, and it takes like 45 minutes to an hour just to get to the grocery store.
And what happens when you live in a food desert is that the amount of produce you buy goes down because it's such a hassle to get, and the amount of processed food you buy goes up because dollar stores and gas stations might be the only places in walking distance you can go to get food. So you might not be able to buy a bag of apples, but you'll always be able to find a bag of Doritos. This is America. But John Catsimatidis actually has more in common with Zohran than I bet he'd like to admit. Because the same dynamics that caused grocery stores to leave towns and food deserts to emerge hit Gristides as well. And at a certain point, the Gristides owner had to make a choice. And it was the same choice made by every small city that opted to open their own grocery store. Because this is not just a story about public versus private ownership, but about big business versus small business and the people who get left holding the bag. This is city-owned grocery stores.
So the thing that never gets talked about, which kind of makes the whole debate a little silly, is that before there were private supermarkets, this whole country was municipally owned markets. That was the main way people got their food. So this fear that socialism or whatever is going to spread because Zohran wants to build a network of city-owned grocery stores designed for access and affordability, that already happened. We already did that for decades and decades. Markets were set up for access and affordability by municipalities, like they were a public utility, because why would food be different from water or sanitation? In fact, to give you an idea of what the ethos used to be, in Boston, like everywhere else, businesses wanted to privatize the market system. And listen to the response they got. Laissez-faire was inappropriate for the supply and distribution of meat and vegetables, where government has no greater duty than to regulate. The Boston Committee on Free Markets said that during the Gilded Age. So food was just a public good, and it was up to lawmakers to guarantee it. They probably didn't succeed 100% of the time, but their greatest failure was when they finally handed it over to capitalism to do whatever it wanted. And a lot of the issues today are a product of that. So let's go back to a time in New York when there were way more than the handful of markets Zohran's proposing. When public markets were just the primary way people got their food. They were strategically placed, and the scale of the individual market depended on the population of the area. So the densest parts of the city had the biggest markets, and more sparsely populated parts had smaller markets. But the point is that everyone in the city would be within a manageable walk from a market that basically had everything they needed. But here's a wrinkle. Butcher's meat was a really big part of the American diet at the time, and the butcher's trade was heavily regulated. Markets were composed of a bunch of stalls for various vendors. Butcher stalls acted as sort of anchors for public markets. Other vendors would just naturally fill out the surrounding stalls. And importantly, butchers were only allowed to operate in these city-owned stalls. As the city grew, the stalls were supposed to expand, and they did, but there was lag time, and the lag time would get worse and worse. Now, the other thing is that the organized meat industry opposed the system entirely because they didn't want to be regulated. Now, by the 1830s, investments were really falling behind urban growth. New York went from 30,000 people in 1790 to 300,000 people in 1840. 50 years for a 1,000% increase in population, and the government just didn't anticipate that kind of growth. So as people moved north through Manhattan, the city failed to accommodate them, which empowered the private butcher shops that wanted fewer restrictions, and from there was just a downward spiral. And by 1843, the meat industry won and got themselves deregulated, and they could just open shops anywhere in the city they wanted. As butcher shops became more diffuse, so did everything else. Private shops would siphon residents away from public markets, thus less business for the other vendors. The system was becoming a smaller part of people's lives, and the demand wasn't universal anymore, and that's a really important detail. And by 1855, there was no connection between the size of the markets and the neighborhoods they were meant to serve, which meant that some areas were well served and others weren't. The public market system was beginning to unravel. Now, the USDA knew this. They also felt like the whole food system really needed to be reformed. So they did a study, and one thing it found was that food distribution became a lot more difficult when the population of a certain place exceeded 100,000. If we go back to New York, the city hit 100,000 people in 1820, and by the 1840s, the system had fundamentally changed. The reason was not that governments were suddenly incapable of delivering food to people. Public markets in towns under 100,000 people seemed to work just fine. But when a city crossed that 100,000 mark, that's generally when the closest farms couldn't keep up anymore. It became impractical for farmers to sell directly to consumers, and there were middlemen, which drove up costs. And it's at that point that it became easier to succumb to the pressures of businesses and trade groups than it was to just build out the public system. So this was the first big shift from public food distribution to private, which was around the mid to late 1800s. But before we get into the next big shift, let's talk about how it worked in the Soviet Union.
The communists developed the third phase of their blueprint for world domination.
There were two forms of food distribution in the Soviet Union. One was public and the other was private. The public form was that the state managed the food supply, food production.
The farms are planned. Where the farms sell their goods to wholesalers, that's planned.
Food was highly subsidized. It was very, very cheap. The second form of food distribution was peasant markets that were set up within cities.
They had small private plots that the individual members of a collective farm could cultivate, and they could sell their surplus at farmers markets, which was a big source of income for those farmers. And actually, it was also a significant part of the urban food supply.
You might be able to find rabbit or chicken or a variety of, let's say, fruits and vegetables that you might not be able to find, especially in the winter, in a local Soviet grocery store. But the food there was not subsidized, and it was expensive.
So back to America, going into the 1900s, supermarket chains just kept getting bigger and bigger, but even with the takeover of mega chains, food deserts didn't really start happening until the 80s. So a food desert, just to be clear, is when a grocery store is 10 miles away if you're in a rural area, or a mile away if you're in a city. And how Stacy Mitchell of the Institute of Local Self-Reliance breaks it down is this. From the 50s to the early 80s, 25% of grocery sales went to the 8 biggest chains, but independent stores still did well. This is thanks to the Robinson-Patman Act of 1936, which outlawed discriminatory pricing. Basically, even though supermarket chains were relatively new, they were already huge players in the market, big enough that food distributors felt the need to give them discount prices. Along comes the Robinson-Patman Act, which said, no, the cost of a truckload of food is the cost of a truckload of food, no matter what, no matter how big the buyer is, and this evened the playing field. But in the 80s, under Reagan, the government stopped enforcing it. Grocery stores were again beginning to strong-arm suppliers. Chains started centralizing their buying to maximize their ability to leverage their size against suppliers, and in 2001, Walmart became the biggest grocery chain in the whole country. Just to give you an idea of how much power these chains have over suppliers, for years, Walmart had been complaining that they were losing sales because their suppliers weren't filling orders fast enough. So they instituted this policy to basically pressure suppliers to work harder. In 2020, during the pandemic, Walmart told suppliers that shipments must be 98% complete effective September 15th. Suppliers not meeting the new guidance will be fined 3% of the cost of goods. That would be like going into a restaurant saying, look, I know the place is slammed and half the cooks called out sick, but if my entire table doesn't get our food in the next 5 minutes, I'm not paying full price. And now imagine how that might affect the other tables at the restaurant. So over the following decades, big chains would merge into bigger chains with more buying power, and from 1982 to 2017, the market share of independent retailers shrank from 53% to 22%. Which brings us to a pretty common argument from the crowd that is generally against Zohran's idea in city-owned grocery stores. Profit margins are just so thin, which is true. Grocery store margins can be between 1% and 3%, but hearing this argument, you might think that these companies aren't incredibly profitable. And that would be false, because while independent stores struggle, the big chains are raking it in. Kroger CEO, who in 2022 made a modest 671 times their median employee, cleared $15 million in 2023. Their stock also doubled in the last 5 years. Their revenue is close to $150 billion, with a profit of about $2 billion after taxes. So yeah, that's a pretty thin margin comparatively, but it's still like $2 billion. The problem comes when you're working on a much smaller scale and when your 2% net profit isn't $2 billion, but like $100,000 or less. And if your town has a population of 1,000 people in it, that's a pretty small store with a pretty small margin. But first, quick detour back to the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, why were there breadlines?
During the war, there were breadlines, and there was rationing of food. Probably had they not rationed the food, a large portion of the population would have starved and another portion would have lived. But they had an elaborate rationing system and there were lines. In the period when, for example, when I lived in the Soviet Union in the 1980s, there were not long lines in stores. You could go in and buy bread. And you could certainly go in and buy vegetables and other things.
It worked better and worse at different periods. My first trip there was in 1990, the very tail end of the Soviet Union, and the economy was collapsing. You would literally go into a store, and what you'd see in the window was a carefully laid up out pyramid of tuna fish cans. And you go into the store and it would emerge that that's all there was. But that was very much the low point. Things were quite a bit better in the 70s.
I would say there were also shortages in the 1980s under Brezhnev. And those shortages were not throughout the entire country. They were more concentrated in certain places than in others. For example, there were fewer shortages in places like the Caucasian republics in Armenia and Georgia. There was a wonderful array of fruits and vegetables and other things, even in the winter. In Moscow and Leningrad, that wasn't so much the case. But that wasn't because of socialism. I would say that was because of the fact that the country was a lot poorer than the United States. It attempted to make food available to all its people, and it was also involved in a pretty debilitating arms race. So a lot of the budget, which might have been devoted toward, let's say, feeding people and clothing people and doing a whole variety of other things in terms of consumption, had to be devoted to an arms race.
Now, no matter which side you're on with the idea of city-owned grocery stores, if you've read about this, you have read about Kansas. Kansas comes up because they have small towns, which means the grocery stores are small, which means the profit margins are small, which means grocery stores are harder to maintain in these areas. In Kansas, there are two city-owned grocery stores about 8 miles away from each other. One is doing well, and the other was last reported losing $100,000 a year. So what explains this? Well, one is in St. Paul, Kansas, population about 600, and the other is in Erie, Kansas, population about 1,000. Both cities came to own their own grocery stores to fill a need.
You lived here when there wasn't a grocery store. What was that like?
It was pretty rough, actually. You learned to pack coolers with you everywhere you went because we're literally 17 miles to the next Walmart, closest grocery store.
In Erie, there was a supermarket called Stubbs. The owners wanted to retire and they were having trouble finding a buyer, so the city decided to buy it themselves because they were afraid of losing a supermarket altogether. So the city bought it and changed the name from Stubbs to Erie Market. Also, 70% of the residents voted for the city to buy the supermarket, and these are deep red places. Probably not a lot of democratic socialists over there. Now in St. Paul, Kansas, they had been without a grocery store since 1985. The nearest place was Walmart, 16 minutes away by car, or 5 hours on foot. And in the mid-aughts, the mayor made a big push to install a grocery store. The town was on board, and a husband and wife team bought the inventory, ran the store, and I've read reports that the store turned a 3% profit. I wasn't able to verify that number, but someone from the city did emphasize to me that the store is a really important feature in the community. So there was community buy-in from the start, and clearly enough people shopped there to make the store work. But interestingly, city staff said they think their store thrives in part because they do not have a dollar store, meaning there is no other competition in town. But Erie, Kansas does have a dollar store. It's right across the street from the Erie Market, and it's well documented at this point what that means. The owner of another small grocery store in Kansas talked about what happened to him when a dollar store moved close by to his store. Sales dropped and just kept dropping. We averaged 225 customers a day before and immediately dropped to about 175. A year ago, we were down to 125 a day. Basically, we lost 35 to 40% of our sales. I lost $1,000 a day in sales in 3 years. His store closed. So basically, if you have a town that's big enough to maintain a single grocery store, there's not really room for a competitor. And then a Dollar General comes in, a store which benefits from the lowest prices on inventory, notoriously exploitative labor practices, and likely very few losses due to food spoilage because they mainly sell processed foods that could survive a nuclear blast, items which also have the greatest margin anyway. And the Dollar General just wins every time.
Soviet Russia was now a world power to be reckoned with.
What's the core difference between Zohran's proposal and what was happening in the Soviet Union?
That's just like a totally different kind of situation. These stores are going to, if they come to pass, they'll operate within a market economy.
If the city buys food, it will buy it from either agricultural corporations or large food corporations that will sell that food to the city for a profit. In the Soviet Union, all production for profit had been eliminated.
The wholesale and retail prices were set by a centralized planning agency.
Mamdani is operating within a capitalist ecosystem, and he's going to provide food to people, presumably without an additional markup. But the ecosystem is still capitalist.
I'm pretty skeptical, but that's just, as I say, I'll be curious. If they make it work, more power to it.
The very idea that we could do things in this country in a different way that would benefit working people is a threat to corporate profit, even if economically it's not actually a threat. It's the idea that's so threatening.
Now, what if the people who seem to be the most threatened by that idea are actually kind of secret socialists themselves? Because earlier I mentioned John Catsimatidis, and after working on this video, reading about all these things, calling random supermarkets in Kansas, I started wondering, how does Gristedes survive these conditions? They're small, they can't compete with big chains. The Gristedes I was in front of at the beginning never has as many people in it as the Trader Joe's 8 blocks away, and a friend of mine told me that he calls it Greedy's instead of Gristedes, probably because they charge $21 for Dunkin' Donuts coffee that's $8 on Amazon. So how does Gristedes overcome this? They don't. They don't make a profit. At some point, I'm sure they did, but Catsimatidis came to own them in the 80s, and since then, they have almost always lost money. Based on these estimates, Gristedes might lose up to $4.7 million a year. The stores survive because they are subsidized by Catsimatidis' other businesses. Also, a lot of Gristedes exist in buildings that Catsimatidis owns, and in that case, they don't pay rent. Sound familiar? Which means, in a sense, the people who live above a Gristedes are also subsidizing the Gristedes. He's doing his own private socialism. He's doing a socialism, but just in a kind of pointless way. So Catsimatidis came to the same conclusion Zohran came to, and that small towns in Kansas came to, which is maybe maintaining a grocery store is more important than turning a profit. The only difference is that Zohran stores also wouldn't pay property taxes, which is actually huge, because in the city, a medium-sized grocery store might pay close to as much in property taxes as it actually nets in profit. To sum this up, municipally owned grocery stores and markets can work. They worked, albeit in a different form, for like a couple hundred years. Zohran's proposal for city-owned grocery stores can work. If other people in power are willing to fight for it and they don't get in the way, if there's deep community engagement, if some huge chain doesn't move in and derail everything.
Expect more targets coming to New York City.
There are variables, but it can work. Don't be fooled by fear-mongering about the Soviet Union and choice. Also, 30 different kinds of cereal is not choice. And what kind of choice do you have when a grocery store can leave your neighborhood because it wasn't profitable enough? That's not choice. That's the illusion of choice. But that's what the free market gave us. Whether it's New York butchers in the 1840s or Kroger and Walmart in the 1980s or a Dollar General in Kansas today, the dynamic is amazingly similar. A large food interest with ever-increasing size and power benefits from that size and power by getting themselves deregulated. They then buy inventory for impossibly low prices such that no small stores could ever compete. Profits come first, and their role in a given community come way after that, if at all. So they don't care if they destabilize a system of public markets or if they force out of business the one place within walking distance where you can actually buy a vegetable, and they're not afraid to exit entirely, leaving a town or neighborhood with nothing but convenience stores and bodegas. And then, as the public entities weaken, because they're suffocated by a Dollar General, whose CEO, by the way, made $183 million between 2015 and 2021, you have people ready to point to it and say, oh, look, it failed, just like in the Soviet Union, when in fact, it's not at all like in the Soviet Union. Public supermarkets here fail in an extremely American way. They're crushed by mega corporations. Well, hopefully you found this video interesting. My name is Spencer Snyder. You can go follow me on TikTok or Instagram where I post more short-form videos. Thank you for your time, and I'll see you in the next one.